Hey there, learners. Niamh here, and we have another part of the Trying to Solve a 100-Year-Old Family Mystery, and this is part 8, and it is solved. Well, mostly. Okay, so we have pretty much narrowed down the correct family, but we haven't quite figured out the exact person who could be who was the father of my great-grandfather who was adopted. And if you're just coming in now, that's basically the backstory. My great-grandfather was adopted from Lynn County, Missouri in 1914, shortly after his birth. And we know who his birth mother was. She was a woman named Edna Hunt, who was unmarried at the time and gave her child up for adoption. So we've been trying to figure out who the birth father was and using DNA to help with that. So what we've done is we've gone through a lot of our matches, and in the previous part, I talked about our match CMW from 23andMe and how she had ancestors that lived in Lynn County, Missouri at the right time, but up until recently we hadn't been able to find any other tree that connected to hers, any other tree that matched hers of other matches. However, thankfully, recently, my paternal uncle, gave me access to his Ancestry DNA account, and thankfully, on Ancestry, it's more likely that you're going to see people who have attached trees, and we did find matches. So let's look at CMW's tree real quick here. So CMW, her great-grandparents were John Lewis Carruthers and Sarah Leoma Brown. So the Carruthers family, along with the Lomax family and the Browns and the Evans families, all lived in Lynn County, Missouri at the right time, in the right place. So we are definitely looking at one of these four families. And the connection is probably on this generation here, as far as who could be the potential father. So it's either a brother to John Lewis Carruthers. It is not John Lewis Carruthers because, one, he was living in not the right place. He had moved with his family at that particular time. And how much we share with the descendant doesn't match up with what it would be if John Lewis Carruthers was the father. So it could be a brother of John Lewis Carruthers, or it could be one of Melinda Jane Lomax's nephews. It could be a brother to Sarah Leoma Brown, or it could be a nephew of Lucy Ann Evans. We're not really sure. However, thankfully, as I mentioned, my uncle gave me access to his Ancestry account. And as soon as he gave me access, I went straight to his matches and started looking through the trees of his matches. And it was about the 10th match down, someone with the initials AB from Ancestry. I start going through her tree, parent, grandparent, and then I get up to her great-grandparents. Her great-grandparents were Charles Franklin Carty and Mabel Brown. Here's one of those last names. However, Brown is an extremely common surname. I think it's like the 5th most common surname in the United States. So really, if I see Brown, it really doesn't mean much. I'd have to really narrow down and see if this Brown is actually connected to the Browns from CMW. So who are Mabel's parents? Mabel's parents were William H. Brown and Sarah Moore. All right, so let's check out William's parents. His parents were Hamilton Wade Brown and Matilda Pennington. Well, that is certainly familiar because the parents of Stephen Madison Brown from the previous slide are also Hamilton Wade Brown and Matilda Pennington. So we found a direct connection to the Brown family. And this has been pretty huge because that's, we have found a definite connection. We now have 2 people who are descended from the Hamilton Wade Brown and Matilda Pennington. And there we go. So Hamilton Wade Brown had 2 wives, Matilda Pennington and Margaret Jane Dyke. She went by Jane, but her full name was Margaret Jane Dyke. So let's check out all of our other matches and see if we can find more people who connect to to Hamilton Wade Brown. So, Hamilton and Matilda had 9 children, and Hamilton and Jane had 3 children. So I've highlighted Stephen here because this is this is their only child that had moved to Lynn County, Missouri. So, and who we connect to through CMW, our match CMW. But some of these children, I think 2 of them had died in childhood. But yeah, so let's see if we can have some connections here. So I did end up finding another match on 23andMe, MB. She contacted me again, and she's basically in the same position as CMW. They are second cousins. And I've confirmed this. We emailed each other back and forth. She's also descended from Sarah Brown and John Carruthers. So there we go. So the SERVs actually doesn't really help us a whole bunch, but it confirms this connection anyway. So let's move over to William Brown, his brother, and this was AB, the person from Ancestry, and that's her connection that way. So William Brown had 2 wives. I'm not going to separate them out. No real point in doing that. But we also have this match from 23andMe, who also, I didn't actually contact her. I found her name in an obituary, and sure enough, she was on 23andMe, and I confirmed her family tree up to William Brown and descended from Hamilton Wade Brown and Matilda Pennington. There's also 2 more matches from William H. Brown and one of his 2 wives. His son William Jr. and his wife Melissa Jones. I connected this person BL. He was actually also on GEDmatch, but he was on Ancestry. And MH and DH, these are brothers. We found them on MyHeritage and GEDmatch, and they are descended from William Jr. So there we go. So there's another match. We are definitely connected to this family. So then we have with Hamilton's second wife, Jane, I found 2 descendants from MyHeritage. That the JJC is descended from Eliza Jane Moore, which was the daughter of Nancy Brown and Robert Moore. And we also had another one that connected, and so we are definitely connected to Hamilton Wade Brown because we are connected to many descendants of both from his first wife and his second wife. So Hamilton Wade Brown is definitely one of our ancestors. All right, so it begs the question: are we descended from one of the daughters from his second marriage, Jane, or are we actually descended from one of the descendants of Hamilton and Matilda? So we got to see if we are connected to the Pennington line. And we have one match here, PT, and this was actually a 6th cousin once removed or something like that. It was a really distant match, and a lot of times those are really difficult to pin down because some of them could be chance matches because you just happen to share a little bit of DNA, and it would be difficult to find the connection. But then a lot of other times you can find that connection with 6th cousins, and in this case we did just that. I contacted this person, and talked about in fact, I only contacted this person because I was searching for the Pennington surname on 23andMe on our matches, my grandfather's matches, and this was one of the only people who showed up who listed Pennington as one of their ancestral surnames. So, going up her line, we have many connections here, the Bowling family, and then to Mary Pennington and Micaiah Pennington. And so how's that connected to Matilda Pennington? Let's see. All right, so there we go. Mary Pennington was the sister of Edward Pennington, who was the grandfather of Matilda Pennington, mother to Stephen Madison Brown. So on this, I also put, because this is the likely connection here, so my grandfather, D.E. Scott, and P.T. are, great, so first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. So P.T.'s sixth great-grandfather is my grandfather's fifth great-grandfather. So there we go. All right. So, according to this anyway. So the next thing we got to figure out is, are we actually descended from both Stephen Brown and his wife Lucy Evans, or are we just descended from Stephen Brown? Meaning, while we think his children are at the correct age to be the potential father of my great-grandfather, it's still technically possible that he could be the father. So, I mean, he would clearly be an old man, but, I mean, stranger things have happened. So, it's certainly possible that Stephen Madison Brown was actually the father. So, how do we determine that? We have to determine that by seeing if we connect to his wife. If we connect to Lucy Ann Evans. And I found a match on 23andMe, ASK, and I went through their tree and also looked through records and figured out that ASK is descended from Luke Watkins and Nancy Hopkins. So are they related to Lucy Ann Evans? Let's see. Yes, they are. So Wiley Watkins is the brother of Mark America Watkins, which was Lucy Ann Evans' maternal grandfather. So there we go. We have that connection. And there has been at least, there was one other connection with the Watkins line, someone who was listed as a second to third cousin to ASK on MyHeritage. He had the last name Watkins, and he was, second to third cousin seems to work out just fine for being descended from the Watkins line. So I can't add him as a definite Watkins connection here, but all the evidence points that we have at least two connections to Lucy Ann Evans's line. So that is basically telling us that not just Stephen is our ancestor, but Lucy is our ancestor as well, which means Stephen is not the father of my great-grandfather, so it's one of their sons. All right, so let's look at the family of Stephen Brown and Lucy Evans. So they had 6 children, and we can eliminate a few of them right off the bat as being the potential father. Of course, the 2 women are not the father because they're women, and the youngest brother died as a child. As you can see, he was 5 years old, quite sad, but that eliminates him as the father as well. So we have 3 potential fathers for my great-grandfather, and it is definitely between these 3 because, as we saw from all those connections, we are definitely connected to the Brown line in multiple ways. We're connected to the Penningtons, we're connected to the Evans, so this is the family that my great-grandfather came from. So, which of these, now I got to see which of these brothers were living in Lynn County, Missouri in 1913, which was the year that my great-grandfather was conceived. So let's see, where were they living? Okay, we got 2 that were living in Lynn County, Missouri, and 1 who had moved to California. So I think we can eliminate William David Brown. I mean, technically, he is still in the running, only because it's possible he visited his family, but, path of least resistance tells us it's either John or Jerome. So that brings us to seeing who their descendants are. So John he had 2 daughters and had many grandchildren and great-grandchildren. There are a lot of descendants of John Cary Brown alive today that I can contact and see if any of them are interested in doing a DNA test, because at this point, the only way we're going to tell which brother fathered my great-grandfather is to see how closely related we are to their descendants. So, unfortunately, Jerome only had 1 son, and I did find that son, but he unfortunately died in 2012, and he had no descendants of his own. So, and that is also unfortunate because my father and I believe that Jerome Brown is likely the father, and we think that only because of age. Edna Brown, my great-grandfather's birth mother, she was born in 1892, so she's already 10 years younger than Jerome here. And Jerome's brother John here is, almost 20 years older than Edna, about 18 years older. So it just seems more likely that Jerome was the father of Vernon, my great-grandfather. Next thing I'm going to do now is we're going to use the WATO tool on DNA Painter, and WATO stands for what are the odds. So I'm going to be putting in a lot of these descendants that we've connected to on DNA sites and putting in how connected we are to them and seeing the likelihood of which family, basically cementing that it is the Brown family that we're descended from. Okay, so we are on the website dnapainter.com, and in their tools area is a program called What Are the Odds, or WATO is what a lot of people call it. How this works, and it did take me a little bit to kind of understand how this all works, but I've pretty much figured it out, and hopefully I can demonstrate this to you all. So you start with the most recent common ancestral couple, or really any ancestral couple. I'm actually going to put this as an ancestral triple, and I'm going to have this one be Hamilton Wade Brown along with both of his wives. So Hamilton Brown and Matilda Pennington and Jane Dyke. Okay, so that is this section. Now, let's start doing their children here, the children that we have connections to. So, add child. I'm going to have this one be William H. Brown. William H. Brown. Okay, and then I'm going to add another child. This is going to be Stephen Madison Brown. And then I'm also going to put in Nancy, which is the child with Jane. Nancy Brown. Her middle name was Belle Brown. And now, these are not full siblings. Nancy is actually the half-sibling of William and Stephen because she is Hamilton's daughter with Jane, and whereas William and Stephen are Hamilton's sons with Matilda. So, to put that in here, we have to define half relationships. So, she is the half-sister to both William and Stephen, so I'm going to check both of their things off. And now we have that designated as a half relationship. Now, let's start putting in the descendants. And I'm going to speed this part up and we can catch up. Okay, I have most of this set up here. Now what I need to do is I need to put in the how much each of these matches match with my grandfather. So I'm going to start with CMW. She was where this is concerned, where we're probably at here. So she shares 131 centimorgans with my grandfather. So that's how much they share. And then MB, she shares 93. Save. So JJC, CM match, she also shares 93 with my grandfather. BMW. All right. Now, we also have that PT match, which was all the way further back on the Pennington line. So I'm going to go ahead and add a parent to this. I won't be adding more parents, so this will just be for Matilda here. Okay, and PT shares 31 centimorgans. All right, so now what does this mean? Well, right now it doesn't really mean much. What we have to do is start putting in the hypothesis in. So how that works. Now, our main hypothesis is that either John Carey Brown or Jerome Claiborne Brown is the father of Vernon. So add a child, edit name, Vernon Helmer Scott, who is my great grandfather. Add child, edit Vernon Helmer Scott. Now the hypothesis is actually my grandfather, who is the son. So enter use as hypothesis, and we're going to add a child and use as hypothesis. So all of these people are in relation to my grandfather. So my grandfather is the hypothesis here. So I will name this tree D.E. Scott Sr. There we go. So right now they have the same score because they're at the same position. So let's try seeing if my grandfather fits anywhere else within this tree. We know that we're from this tree, and we are descended from Stephen Madison Brown and his wife Lucy, because we match with Lucy and her descendants, her ancestors. But for the sake of argument, let's say that Stephen is the father of Vernon. So let's add a child. Edit name, we'll put Vernon here. Vernon Helmer Scott. And add child, and here's the hypothesis. Now, look at how these numbers jumped. This has a score of 1, which means it's technically possible, but both of these have a score of 69. So these two options are 69 times more likely to be the case than this option. So that's pretty big. We can tell this even without having to connect with Lucy Ann Evans. We know that it's extremely likely that it's these possibilities. But let's try putting the possibility in other locations and seeing if how these hypotheses change. So I'm going to have Hamilton Wade Brown, even though this seems extremely unlikely. But sure, let's put Vernon in here. And add child and define as hypothesis. Now look at that. This didn't change these numbers because it determined based on how much centimorgans my grandfather shares with all of these people that this hypothesis is impossible. So it gets a score of 0. So Hamilton Wade Brown is not the father of Vernon Helmer Scott. Which we could obviously tell before. Now, before I go a little bit further here, I did want to put one caveat in here, and that is that I use another YouTuber, genealogy YouTuber, Genie Vlogger, whose channel I will link to in the information cards. So he recently did a video on the WATO tool, and he started mentioning how if you put in matches that are under 50 centimorgans, it can mess up the hypothesis scores, which I didn't know about before. I'm going to proceed with this, still using these people here, but I'll change things around a little bit and see if that changes any of the hypothesis and if it really matters at the end of the day with what we're trying to accomplish here. So let's add in some other hypothesis. So another hypothesis is that another of the siblings of these people here, add child. Let's say this is so let's say this child is a full sibling to Stephen and William. So that would make them a half sibling to Nancy. Oh, and let's put this person would be actually a half sibling to all the children, because this is so that actually did bring up the score, because this half sibling would be only the child of Hamilton. So it does actually bring up the score a little bit. It makes it 5 times more likely than this option, but it's still, I mean, we have these hypothesis 1 and 2 far outweighing this one. So that is technically possible. So let's try. So with this child, it is the full sibling of William and Stephen. And let's make this hypothesis. Okay, so that makes it a little more likely. It's 8 times more likely than that, but still we have hypothesis 1 and 2 far outweighing. So let's try seeing if a descendant of William up here could be a hypothesis. So here we have a grandchild to Lily here, and that is an impossible scenario. So that's unlikely. And if we even put in a child, let's say William Brown, add a child. So this option is impossible as well. One other possibility is that it's a child to William David Brown, who was one of their brothers who had moved to California at the time of Vernon's conception, but it would score the same as John and Jerome's descendant here, because it would be in the same position as everyone else. Oh, and let's see. So if we scroll down to what it says here, hypothesis 3, that's the child of John Carey Brown, or the grandchild of John Carey Brown. Same with hypothesis 4 being the grandchild of Jerome Claiborne Brown. This hypothesis is possible. This is the most likely, or equal most likely, it's equal with this one, hypothesis, but it's not significantly more likely than the other hypothesis. All right, so this hypothesis here is about 2 times more likely than the next hypothesis, and this hypothesis is 5 times more likely, and this hypothesis is possible, and then these are impossible. And then down here it's collected data. It's the percentage likely that my grandfather is this relationship to this person. So we really can't do much more with this, because we could start adding in a bunch more hypotheses, but really we've pretty much determined that it's got to be in this area. Sure, these hypotheses are possible, but we already know that that we're descended from both Stephen Madison Brown and his wife. So we're limited to this area here. And when we're limited to just this area, we can disregard the rest, because it is obvious that we're descended from either John or Jerome, and technically William as well. And in fact, I will add William in here just to show that it is technically possible. But he was out of state, and he was living across the country. So unlikely, but technically possible. So, all right. So this is going to be Vernon Helmer. Okay, so if we add in William David here, who's still technically in the running, but unlikely because he was not living in the same area, then yes, he's on equal ground with his 2 brothers, because this is the same position. All right, so how do we figure out which of these brothers, John, Jerome, or William, is the father? Well, we'd have to get DNA from their descendants. So John Carey Brown, add child, he had 2 daughters. So I'm just going to write daughter here. Oh, we'll write this daughter 1. And he also had daughter 2. Now these are the they would be the half siblings of Vernon. So define half siblings. There we go. So I'm going to go into another tool on DNA Painter called the Shared CM project. And this is basically the average amount of centimorgans you should share with your relatives. So this child here, so this child would be a half first cousin. So we could see half first cousin, so here's first cousin, and let's see, do they have, half first cousin. So about 457 centimorgans is how much you would share. Let's go 400. So that person, let's enter CM match, 400. Suddenly numbers change a lot here. These 2 options became impossible. This option is both the descendants of William and Jerome options became still possible, score 23, whereas this one's still at 69, but this one is a clear winner here. So if we have add child, let's put this one at much lower centimorgan amount. Let's say this one is only like 200 centimorgans. How does that change? Okay, well, that has brought this option to a score of 1,009, so it's about 3 times more likely than this option, and this option became impossible now, because if and I actually made a slight error. Let's define half relationship. That's right, they are half siblings. So this, okay, that changed it a little bit. This became a score of 23 now, which was before what it was before, but these jumped up immensely, because a half cousin should share a lot more than 200 centimorgans. Sure, that's technically possible. It is in the range, but it's unlikely. And that is why these options have gone up so high. Now let's think of this child here. This child, they would probably have about half of that. So let's put this one at 200 and see how much things have changed. Nothing has changed because that fits right in. A half first cousin once removed should be, that didn't change anything here. So let's change things around a bit here. Let's delete this column. We'll just stick with the one daughter here, and we'll delete this. So let's say that this is actually, we know that Jerome Claiborne Brown only had one other child who did not have any children. And I'm just going to put private here. There. And he didn't have any children, so we don't have any descendants to test. So we have to rely on the descendants of John Cary Brown, and hopefully they can test. So I'm also going to delete this column here. We're just going to focus on John Cary Brown right now, and see how much they share with my grandfather here. So let's change this to maybe 300 centimorgans. Maybe this person shares only that amount. Now it's become a lot more likely, about twice as likely, that Jerome was the father of Helmer instead of there. And we can change this again to, let's say, 200. There we go. I mean, that makes, both William and Jerome, because they're in the same position. In fact, I'm going to delete William here because we're pretty sure he's not the father. It's technically possible, but it's having him in here just mucks things up. So when this person is at 200 centimorgans, then it becomes a lot more, about twice as likely that Jerome Claiborne Brown is the father. So I'm going to remove CM match, add child. So my grandfather's half first cousin once removed on his, on Edna's side, the descendant of Edna, she's a half first cousin once removed from my grandfather, so technically right here, and she shares 248 centimorgans with my grandfather, putting her at a half cousin once removed. And so that's about how much we're looking at for a descendant of the father of Vernon. So I'm going to cut this in half to show how much descendants of John Cary Brown would likely match with my grandfather. So that's going to be 124. And if we put it like that, then that puts, if we see that, then we know that Jerome Claiborne Brown is the father. But if it's more closely aligned to what my grandfather's half-cousin once removed on his grandmother's side relates to him, then we know that John Cary Brown is the father. So basically what we're trying to do, we're trying to determine whether John Cary Brown or Jerome Claiborne Brown is the father of Vernon, and how much DNA they share with the people, the descendants of John Cary Brown and potentially William David Brown, will tell us whether it is likely that which brother is the father. And there's options where and we don't have descendants for Jerome Claiborne Brown, so we have to base our predictions on the descendants of John Cary Brown and possibly William. So this will be quite tricky, and really it all depends on whether we are able to contact the descendants of John Kerry Brown, see if any of them would be willing to take DNA tests, hopefully with 23andMe, and then we can see where they fit in, where these hypotheses fit in this whole scenario. But even not knowing that we're descended from Lucy Ann Evans and Stephen Madison Brown, even not knowing that, putting in all of this stuff has shown that that is the most likely scenario, that we are descended from those two people. And that was confirmed when we match with the descendants of Lucy. We match with all of these descendants that are from Hamilton Wade Brown. We match with the descendant of Matilda Pennington's family. So we found the right family. This is definitely the right family. The details just need to be worked out, and hopefully we can contact the descendants of John Kerry Brown and see if any of them will test. Okay, so that brings us to the last slide here. So what's next? Part 9. Another adoption? Actually, yes, there is a question along the Brown line. We know that we're descended from Hamilton Wade Brown. We know we're descended from Matilda Pennington. We've connected to the Pennington line for sure. But one question we have is that we don't connect with anyone beyond Hamilton Wade Brown. And there's my dad and I have reason to believe that Hamilton Wade Brown himself was adopted, and so he may not even be a Brown. So we've figured out for sure that we are part of this Brown family. So that's what our last name would have been. But when we start researching the tree of the Browns, we find out that Hamilton may not have himself been a Brown, and I am going to detail that in the next video. And this video has already been way too long and way too complicated. Hopefully it all made sense. Thank you so much for sticking around with me, and I will see you guys in the next part.